From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And ahead today, K-State's Dan O'Brien previews that highly anticipated USDA grain production and stocks report coming out later this morning. And in particular, what the grain trades expect the 2019 row crop production numbers to look like. He advises you grain producers to be at the ready, marketing-wise, if the numbers turn out to be bullish for prices. Also today, K-State's Chris Little is back with us, this time to report on his latest work on charcoal rot disease in soybeans. He'll talk about the various research tactics he and his team are pursuing against it. And K-State's Mary Knapp is standing by to talk Kansas agricultural weather with us, right here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
We're glad to have you aboard for another Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. The grain trades have been pointing to this day for weeks, if not months, for later on this morning at 11 o'clock Central Time, the U.S. Department of Agriculture will post its numbers on 2019 crop production, row crops in particular, essentially the final numbers on those crops, and we'll look at what the trade is thinking about those ahead of the report and other market factors now with Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. Dan, we've talked about this quite some over the recent weeks. In a sense, the markets have been biding time until they get their hands on these crop production numbers, so that day is here.
The day is here. We still, even though in a regular year these would be the pretty much final numbers, again, subject to whatever imbalance or oddity that quarterly stocks reports out into the future would reveal, and which might bring a few tens of millions of bushel of change usually at the most. This year, again, we have a situation where in the northern states, we still have a fair amount of the crop in those states out in the field, particularly corn, South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, perhaps even parts of Iowa to the northern part. Just depends how wet and snowy things were. So even with this number, we'll see a production figure, which I think is the key number in the report, that what the corn production number will be or be estimated to be for 2019, bearing in mind that a month ago we were wondering, well, gosh, how much is still out in the field? Is it 400 million bushels? Is it 5? Is it even more? Some numbers, at least at that time, no doubt have been whittled down some. We're talking about 1 billion plus bushels out there. So I would not doubt with the industriousness of farmers up in that area that's been knocked down quite a bit. So again, we'll have a number. The pre-report estimate for what the size of this crop will be is 13.5 billion bushels and just a little bit more, 13.513. Range of 13.2 to 13.7. Maybe the most telling thing about all that is that gee whiz, there's not a 14 or a 15 in front of that number. Right. It is lower. So a number outside of that range would likely lead to a fair amount of volatility in the market. And we can perhaps come back at the end of this as we talk today about how any changes out of this report might affect farmers' actual marketings. But anyway, there is a projection for the U.S. corn yield to be down about a bushel, down to 166.2 bushels per acre for about 450 to 500,000 fewer harvested acres. And again, there'll be a projection on that harvested area without some of those acres even being harvested yet. So that'll be an issue. For the soybean part of this report, production forecast for 3.512 billion bushels was at 3.55, and the last report we had, which is basically the November report, December just kept everything the same. Range of 3.46 to 3.56 billion bushels. So, pretty similar in terms of the potential market impact from a number that would be either lower or above that range. But analysts are anticipating some lowering of harvested acres for soybeans as well, about 150 million down to 75.46. So we'll be watching that.
And complementing that will be the USDA's quarterly stocks report. Now, all eyes will be riveted on the production numbers, but we can't bypass those stocks numbers either.
Well, yes. Normally the DEES-1 set of numbers is measuring grain that is 98% in the bin. And again, this year there's almost there'll be kind of a division between what's secured and in some of those northern states, what's not in yet. And that's, frankly, I think, been a big question amongst market watchers heading into this report is how will the USDA handle designated grain stocks on December 1 that aren't harvested at this time and hopefully are still standing on the stocks if it's corn. So, again, anticipation of 1.917 billion bushels of wheat on December 1 storage, 11.5 of corn, 3.1 or 3.2 of soybeans, and across the board, those numbers are down from what they were December 1 of last year. Down about 100 million bushels for wheat, down about 400 million bushels for corn, down about 600 or 700 million bushels for soybeans from what we were a year ago. And thus, with that, we see some support for prices.
Now, of interest, certainly in the Central Plains region as well, the USDA will be trotting out its winter wheat seedings numbers, again for the 2020 harvest. Those will be out likewise here within the hour. What are the expectations there on the part of trade watchers? Not
for a lot of change, just a continuation of the downward trend we've seen in the last several years. Hard red winter wheat acres estimated to be about 22.1 million, down from about 22.5 for previous estimates of wheat plantings for this year coming out of the USDA in their long-term forecasts. A fair range around that, say for hard red again, about 21.4 to 23.1. So I think we've seen our colleagues in here at KSU in past years, Bill Turney, indicated to the market in some info we put out that acreage may go up and down, but really yield and harvested acreage as opposed to planted will be what really tells the tale. So with that, again, the moisture we get from now through March, the status of the crop, of the hard red winter wheat crop in Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas, moving on into spring once we break dormancy, will tell probably more than this does. I should say I don't want to run too far ahead without talking about ending stocks estimates, because again, on the production side, we'll be watching the production numbers, and of course, the production numbers will be taken right through those supply-demand balance sheets, and the bottom line key figures will be the amount of ending stocks that are out there, and anticipation that there'll be little change from what the USDA had indicated before about wheat. But for corn, already anticipation of ending stocks figures dropping from about 1.9 billion down to 1.76. So 150 million bushels already dialed in for expectations. So therein lies our challenge. If we get that much of a drop or more, well, that's supportive of prices. If we get a drop, but it's not quite as much, 1.8 billion, 1.85 instead of 1.76, well, the market would interpret that as quote, disappointing, and it would not be supportive for prices. For beans, anticipation of about a 50 million bushel decline from 475 million down to about 424 or 425. So dialed in for corn and beans are anticipations of about 150 million bushels less corn in stocks, about 50 million less bushels of soybeans, and then we'll see where prices go from there.
Now, to that point then, Dan, and you hinted at it a moment ago, the markets once more have been poised to respond to this January WASDE report, the new numbers, for quite a while now. And if there are surprises on either end of the estimations on the part of the trade, will that likely lead to immediate and notable volatility in the trade?
Volatility, almost assured. It'd be really surprising with all this anticipation, all the build-up for this particular report this year. Again, for months, literally for months, for about 2 or 3 months now, we've been aiming towards the January annual crop production report as hopefully the time when these questions would, quote, get answered about the size of crops. So with this, the production number will come in. We'll run through the supply-demand balance sheet for corn and soybeans. We'll plug that in. We'll see where the ending stocks are. And from there, as we look at these trading days here, that report will come out shortly at 11, and we've got till around 1 thereafter for the market response. So it's a time to be watchful. If the market interprets these numbers negatively, I'm not sure many of our grain sellers would take advantage of that, or buyers might, in the usage industries. But if the numbers come in short and we get the volatility to the higher side, the last thing we want to tell anybody to do is to be just jumpy and overreactive. But if we get volatility to the higher side, and if it would move, above $3.95 to $4 or something like that, or above, and we have old crop grain, it's something to look at. Of course, you have to look at local basis bids and all of that, but still move to the higher side from tighter supply-demand balance, shorter supplies would be sure friendly to the grain markets. And then we just have to see what opportunities we have for sales locally. And it would be good to look at these things and not miss out on any opportunities that could happen if the markets interpret the outcome positively.
So, you producers holding on to old crop, be ready to capture whatever potential favorable prices might be coming your way, for it ought to be an interesting next couple of hours when the numbers come out at 11 o'clock, and then how the market responds for the balance of the trading day. We shall see. And Dan, thanks for the comments. We'll catch up with you again next Friday.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Speaking there with Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and we will be back in a few moments on the K-State Radio Network. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Welcome back. You're tuned to Agriculture Today. You might recall ahead of the holiday break, we had a chance to visit with K-State Research plant pathologist Chris Little. Row crop diseases are Chris's specialty, and at that time we took up his work on countering the sudden death syndrome problem in soybean production. Well, we've invited Chris back in to tackle another disease issue in beans, charcoal rot, and approaches he's taking in research against that often costly pathogen. Now, charcoal rot, because of what we know about its nature, may not have been as pressing as was SDS this past growing season. Chris?
Well, it's really interesting because we always say charcoal rot is a drought disease, unlike sudden death syndrome is a wet field disease or a high moisture disease. Now, recent studies from Tennessee have indicated that you can get pretty good charcoal rot colonization of roots even under irrigated systems. So this fungus is capable of colonizing plants, even though you might not have the stress that really makes the charcoal rot disease come on.
So what is at the, pardon the expression, root of that?
Well, the fungus likes to colonize the plant, and whether or not it actually causes disease, that is yield loss, is usually due to a stressor. Okay, so just because the fungus is there, it may not be as severe until the environment changes and switches the fungus on and really makes it severe. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so we've all heard about macrophyllina, phaseolina, I think. Kind of pound it home at least once or twice a year. It's another soil-borne. We love to study soil-borne pathogens. It survives in the soil. It survives in residue. And what's really interesting when you look at the disease yield loss data All over the Midwest, everyone's SCN, but in Kansas, charcoal rot is our number one yield reducer.
Still.
Yeah, still our number one problem compared to SCN. So, again, it can be hard to measure what those yield losses really are because the fungus can just colonize the root, and maybe it sits there, maybe it drags yield down to a point where it's hard to measure. Sometimes we don't know, is it because of drought or is it because of the disease? Do we have a yield impact? And so those are awfully difficult to pull apart. But again, wet early seems to be no problem for the fungus to colonize the roots. And then when you have stress during that vegetative to reproductive transition, which often happens at flowering, right, you might see some charcoal rot begin to show through mid-season wilt, early senescence. A couple, 3 weeks early, you start seeing some plant senescing. You pull up some stems and you see little black dots, little black bodies called microsclerotia. That's how the pathogen, the fungus, survives in those little black structures. And so it has no problem colonizing. It's a necrotroph. That means it likes to kill tissue and colonize it so that it can get its nutrition that way. So we try to tell people, and there's been a lot of research on this, anything that we can do to manage plant stress is going to be great at managing charcoal rot.
And if you get
whatever mechanism that might be.
Irrigating soybeans
Sure.
helps, obviously, in the drought scenario.
Now, we have a lot of dryland soybeans, so irrigation is not always an option. But there's been plenty of work that shows that managing your plant population, controlling insects, which is a stress, controlling weeds, which is a competitor, things like this can help to control charcoal rot. If you can adjust your maturity to later maturity, adjust planting dates, that sort of thing, you can maybe avoid that stressful window at flowering. And I think there's more host resistance available out there. It's still sort of been a continual slow process to try to identify varieties that are actually resistant. And that's certainly one of the areas that we work on, is looking at maturity group 3 through 5, which we might find in the state, and screening it for resistance through a number of different mechanisms. We're doing some work with Monsanto, for example, to look at some of their varieties with a couple screening methods we're using. So there's a lot of other folks in a lot of other states, especially in the South, where we get a lot of stress, that are also working on these kinds of projects.
With your tact here of screening varieties for their ability to withstand charcoal rot, fend it off, are you discovering that there are some candidates out there that can get it done?
There are, and there have been a few releases. Let me back up. Mm-hmm. I think that one of the best things that we can do to find resistance or tolerance to charcoal rot is use highly adapted varieties. Okay.
That'll be healthy otherwise.
Stuff that's going to be able to perform very well in our environment. I don't want to take a variety from central Illinois that likes it wet and try to put it in west central Kansas, for example, because there may be a problem with stress there. So we have some methods, including another toxin assay. So this is another fungus that makes a toxin, and also kind of a necrosis assay where we can actually measure the amount that the fungus grows down the tip of a cut stem, and kind of measure that and see between one variety and another, the farther the necrosis grows down the cut stem. And so there are some quick assays like that, and varieties definitely do differ. Now, whether or not that lab assay matches what happens in the field is a different story, because in the lab we're only testing what the fungus is doing. What I want to remind listeners of is that it's not just what the fungus is doing, but also what the environment is doing. And so that's what can make it really difficult. And so that's why we're trying to develop some root-based inoculation procedures and also trying to incorporate some drought stress and some heat stress in the greenhouse and see if we can do some screening that way. And that's been a little bit of a challenge to get that to work, but I think that we're going to get there. But a couple things that I want to mention have to do with cultural management, and one is cover crops. So we've got a great relationship with Gretchen Sassenrath in southeast Kansas where we're looking at mustard cover crops. And what's really been interesting with those is that mustard cover cropping does seem to reduce the amount of pathogen colonization in the soybean root. That's been very interesting to us. Does it increase yield? Not necessarily. But it makes me wonder that if we can reduce the pathogen in a problematic field over time, if that will have benefit to, soil health. We hear a lot about soil health these days and what that means. Can cover crops assist and improve soil health and maybe reduce pathogen activity? Another area, working with Gretchen and with Craig Roseboom as well, just some relatively new data looking at tillage. So if we grow the mustard before the soybean crop earlier in the year, and do we disc it in? Do we roll it? Do we leave it standing? Do we mow it? And some of the fresh data that I was looking at just today sort of shows that disking and leaving it standing had higher pathogen colonization in the roots. And if it's rolled in or mowed, it was lower. So certainly this is the second, I believe, year of that study, so it'll be another one coming after that. So the verdict is still out on how management of the mustard might influence charcoal rot.
It really is interesting, these land treatments, as they've been tried out for multiple positive purposes, can have potentially these offshoot disease management benefits.
Right. So really improved soil texture, improved soil nutrition, improved soil water holding capacity, often reduced disease, not always, but sometimes. So I think there's potential to really look at all the benefits of a cover crop system. And if it works in a person's economic analysis at the end of the day, then that's super. So, again, I just get back to that yield drag that charcoal rot can have. Sometimes is invisible, can't necessarily see it, but I think that any time we do things that improve our crop agroecosystem and conserve moisture, we're going to see a benefit when it comes to this disease.
Well, in that you and your colleagues are coming at the problem in a multifaceted way and are finding out some highly important things about contending with it. Keep up the good work, Chris. We appreciate the briefing right here. Many thanks to you.
Thank you very much.
On the current research tactics at K-State against charcoal rot disease in soybean production, that's research plant pathologist Chris Little of Kansas State University. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and we'll be back after these moments away over the K-State Radio Network.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State research and extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today, and it's time to get caught back up on Kansas agricultural weather. It's our first opportunity following the holidays to visit with climatologist Mary Knapp of K-State Research and Extension, and she is toting volumes of information on the past month of December as well as the trends in 2019, plus what's rolling in weather-wise this weekend. But Mary, let's look at December. You say it was as the records go, wetter and warmer than normal. Is that correct?
That is correct, and that holds for most of the state. We had, if you want to call it, the miracle storm to end the month on the 28th and 29th. It came as rain, and it came on unfrozen ground. So there was a lot of ability for the soils to absorb that. One of the nicest things about that storm was that it did include southwestern Kansas,
which was wanting badly.
Very much needed rainfall in that area. We did see the erasure of the extreme drought in that area. Some areas had 2 categories of improvement. They had over 1.5 inches of rain, and so it warranted that kind of improvement. But it hasn't completely eliminated the drought in the West by any means whatsoever. There's a lot of severe and moderate drought still out there, and some abnormally dry conditions, particularly as you go into west central and northwestern Kansas. Statewide, we averaged 1.27 inches, which is 123% of normal.
And again, December was on the warm side as historical trends go.
Right. Statewide, we averaged 4.7 degrees warmer than normal. The average temperature was 36 degrees. The warmest areas were East Central and Southeast. The East Central Division averaged 36.7 degrees, which was 5.2 degrees warmer than normal, and that was the warmest division in the state.
Well, we could spend hours talking of the numbers on 2019 in total, which we don't have at our disposal. But to characterize the year briefly, we know it was wet. How wet?
It was the 4th wettest year statewide average for our period of record going back to 1896. Not surprisingly, since we had 2 months that set all-time records for the month, May and August. And the May record is noteworthy in that monthly precip was the wettest month ever in our period of record. So it supplanted 1993's July record. It's also worth noting that August tied the 1993 July total. All the divisions, even the Southwest, came out as at or above normal for the year. The Southwest has 1/100 of an inch deficit for the year, which when you round up, it's like 99.9% of normal, so that comes out as 100%.
Close enough.
Normal. So very, very close. The surplus for the year statewide was 6.42 inches. Should note Southeast Kansas, their surplus was 15.91 inches. There are places in the western parts of the state that did not get 15 inches in the entire year, let alone have that much excess. So, again, that was a problem. On the temperature side, slightly cooler than normal. It was like the 25th coolest year of record. So not the coldest, but it's certainly on the colder side of the scale rather than the warmer pattern that we saw to end the year.
All right, from looking back to looking ahead now, we are expecting that real wintry weather will return, possibly one of the most notable events we've had so far in this winter season.
Well, it'll certainly be the most notable winter event of the year. That's since true. We started we're not very far. And in fact, this will be the first measurable moisture for most locations for the year. The trajectory of the storm looks like it's going to include parts of the southwest, move up through central and north central Kansas, and then have the heaviest moisture in the eastern divisions. They're going to particularly east central and southeast, basically looking at that I-35 line and eastward. Cold air's coming in. It's already snowing out in western Kansas. Oakley had some snow on the ground already. So that will overcome the rest of the state as we go into tonight and tomorrow. I advise anybody that's doing any traveling to check for those road conditions updated. We are expecting some strong winds to go along with the storm, which will, of course, create visibility issues, blowing snow. And if you've got a little patch of frozen roadway, getting a crosswind can really hamper your driving abilities.
Moreover, this colder pattern will persist for a time, says the extended outlook.
The 6 to 10-day outlook has a very strong probability of colder than normal across the state. As we move to the 8 to 14-day outlook, carrying us towards the end of January, it's still expected to be cooler than normal, although not quite so cold. The question is how much moisture will come following this particular storm. The 6 to 10-day favors wetter than normal conditions across the northern two-thirds of the state, but it's not a strong probability, and that erodes even more as we go into the 8 to 14-day outlook. The other thing that's kind of worth noting is the Climate Prediction Center has an experimental product where they look at hazards coming out, and they do have a period of significant chance of colder than normal temperatures starting about the 17th of January. So
a week from today.
A week from today. So we could have this system come through, a brief warm-up, and then be followed by a second round of the extreme cold.
So for the next 24 hours or so, be very cognizant of what's happening with the weather concerning your travel plans and so forth. Mary, we appreciate the briefing. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
Climatologist Mary Knapp, K-State Research and Extension, and thanks to you, likewise, for tuning in. Please be back with us right here on Monday. Eric Atkinson bidding you a good weekend for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.